Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many of you join us this evening. I'm Matthew Silverman, Director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our program exploring When Judaism and Christianity Parted Ways with Professor Michal Siegal. Thank you to the Hack family and Dr. Anita Solomon, who are grateful to sponsor this lecture in loving memory of Samuel Hack. Samuel was a dedicated member of the Catholic Jewish Dialogue Group of Greater Washington, D.C., co-founded and co-led by his lifelong friend, the Institute's founder, Rabbi Joshua Haberman, and Monsignor Ralph Kuhlner, and subsequently, Reverend Leo Lefebvre. For 45 years, Sam, together with his wife, Anita Hack, and then with his beloved Anita Solomon, participated in the group's lively discussions to promote interfaith understanding and connection. Our program this evening will hopefully keep this vision shared by Rabbi Haberman and Samuel Hack alive and continue to advance interfaith understanding and connection throughout the community. If you have any questions during the presentation, please click on the Q&A button on your Zoom screen and try to keep your questions as concise as possible and use complete sentences so that we can discuss as many as we're able to get to. And I would now like to welcome Art Hessel, the Haberman Institute Board Vice President, to introduce our speaker. Welcome, Art.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. I'm the Vice President of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies. I welcome you all here tonight to hear Professor Michal Siegal's presentation on When Did Judaism and Christianity Part Ways? If you feel that your living room is a little crowded tonight, it's because we have almost 800 registrants for this program, and most of you are here. So we welcome the crowd and can take in as many as can come. For those who couldn't make it, they and you will be able to see this talk on our website, www.habermaninstitute.org. That's easy. It should be available within the next few days. And in fact, when you go to the website, you'll see we have about 200 podcasts and video casts of previous lectures. You can pick your topic, you can pick your time, and it will take you through your entire summer vacation. You don't have to cart any books along with you. The Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies has been providing adults with high quality, in-depth encounters in Jewish thought, history, and culture for the past 40 years. Our name honors our founder, Rabbi Joshua Haberman, whose vision created this organization in 1983 upon his retirement from Washington Hebrew congregation. We invite you to learn more about us and our programs and classes by visiting our website. Our next lecture will be next Wednesday, June the 7th at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. We will welcome Dr. Vanessa Paloma Elbaz from the University of Cambridge and the Sorbonne. She will be speaking on Sephardi women's voices and music, Jewish tradition, continuity, and survival. One more thing, if I may. Our fiscal year ends June 30. Like most other nonprofit organizations, we exist through donations and contributions made by our listeners and viewers, families like the family of the late Samuel Hack, as Matt discussed. Please consider making a donation. We make it easy for you on our website, and there will be a link on the survey that we will provide you after the program. And now on to tonight. Professor Michal Siegal, backed by popular demand, is a scholar of rabbinic Judaism. Her work focuses on aspects of Jewish-Christian interactions in the ancient world and comparisons between early rabbinic and Christian sources. She's a faculty member of the Goldstein-Goren Department of Jewish Thought at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Beersheba, Israel. She's an elected member of the Israel Young Academy of Sciences And equally as important, she's a member of the Haberman Institute's Academic Advisory Board. Her first book, Early Christian Monastic Literature in the Babylonian Talmud, won the 2014 Manfred Lautenschläger Award. And her second book, Jewish Christian Dialogues on Scripture in Late Antiquity, Heretic Narratives of the Babylonian Talmud, was a finalist in 2019 for the National Jewish Book Award. I first met Professor Barasher Siegal some years ago at a meeting of American Associates, Ben Gurion University of the Negev, and I have followed her many activities since. A few years ago, she spoke to the Haberman Institute, and yes, you can see her original presentation on our website. The subject was the subject of her second book. This year, she's been on sabbatical from Ben Gurion and has spent her time in New Haven as the Horace Goldsmith Visiting Associate Professor of Judaic Studies at Yale. Yale has become, I think, her second home, and certainly her home here in the United States. And I understand that this fall she'll be going up a bit to Cambridge, where she'll be at the Harvard Law School as the Gruss Visiting Professor of Talmudic Law. With that, I turn the Zoom over to you, Michal, and we are all looking forward to learning with you, and thank you for sharing your expertise and your insight with us.
Thank you very much, Art. Can you hear me? Good. Thank you very much for this wonderful, wonderful introduction. With one correction, Yale is not a step down from Harvard. I just want to point this very, very clearly. I'm very happy to be at Harvard next year, but Yale is Yale. And I'm very happy to be invited here, and it feels nice to come back. We were just talking that last time that I spoke for Haberman Institute, I was we were in the midst of an epidemic, so it's nice to be in a healthier environment. And I was asked by Matt to try to take a step back. And to take a step back and ask the bigger question. And the bigger question I don't want to ask today is the question of how did it all start? So I'm going to take a step back and talk a little bit about my education and what I do in my research, and then ask the big question. So I am a scholar of rabbinic literature. I deal with the Babylonian Talmud, but I ask the question of Jewish-Christian interaction in that very, very important and central text to Jewish culture. In fact, the most important text for Jewish culture from the 11th century on. And I look at this Babylonian Talmud and I ask, what can it teach me about Jewish-Christian relations? And this is my previous talk that, as Art said, you can find on the website. I try to talk about heretic stories when the Talmud tells us about conversation between rabbis and heretics. What does it tell me about the composer, the author of this tradition? And what does it tell me about its audience? And especially what it tells me about their knowledge of Jewish-Christian interaction and what I try to do with that knowledge when they created these stories between heretics and rabbis. So that was my previous talk in my second book. Today, I want to talk about something new that I'm in the midst of working on. So I'm in the midst of writing a book that's actually a semi-academic book. It's meant for a wider readership, and where I try to take a step back and ask about Jewish-Christian relations in the first century CE, view from a distance, view from a bird's eye view, try to ask, how were Jews and Christians relation in these first century CE? Is it a simple question to ask with a simple answer, or is it a little bit more complicated than that? Can give you my answer. My answer is it is complicated, very complicated. But my attempt in my book is basically to try to map out what Christians say about Jews in the various sources and what Jews say about Christians in those sources. And then from that very complicated pictures, try to answer the question, what did Jews and Christians know about each other? How were they in touch with each other? What did they know? And how did they react to that knowledge? And in what way those two religions developing side by side influenced, interacted, were in dialogue with each other. So that's my project. And what I want to do in the next hour or so is to present some of those sources to you and try to ask together the question, how did Judaism and Christianity separate? How did they become two separate religions? How did they become two separate entities? In what ways what does that mean to become two religion, right? Side by side. So that's the question for today. And I want to start, let me share my screen by reading text. So that's what we'll do together today. So the first text I want to bring is a text that's from the 2nd century CE. Now, everything I tell you about dating, etc., is very vague. We don't know when this text was actually written. This is what scholars think, and it's vague enough to be around the 2nd century CE. We don't know who wrote this text, and we don't know who this person. So Mathetis is a beloved, a friend, disciple, and he's writing this letter to the Ignatius, but we don't know who that is, right? So we don't know who these people are. We have a manuscript of this text. I'm going to read this text a little bit and try to start from there. So this text says the following. And next, let me put my laser pointer. And next, I imagine that you are most delirious of hearing something on this point, that the Christians do not observe the same forms of divine worship as do the Jews. But as to their scrupulous concerning meats and their superstition as respects the Sabbath, and their boasting about circumcision, and their fancies about fasting and the new moon, which are utterly ridiculous and unworthy of notice, I do not think that you need to learn anything from me. We're going to stop here for a second and talk about what this text is about. So he's writing this letter to someone, and he's saying, I know that you want to hear from me. Why do Christians and Jews worship differently? And in what way they're different? Our questions, right? This is exactly the question we want to ask today. So here we have an answer. 2nd century CE, a writer is about to define what makes a Jew and what makes a Christian. Okay, so let's look at his list. So he's making a list. Sometimes when I teach this class, can't do this now because I can't see any of the people who are listening to me, but when I teach this in live, a lot of the time what I do is I say to everyone, if you had to make a list of what makes a Jew, I don't know how far your list would have been from this one. I actually did this experiment a few times and the lists were very, very close. And this is the list that he has. Yeah. Okay, so let's start. Scrupulosity concerning meats. In other words, kosher, right? Dietary laws. So number 1, this is what the Jews do. Number 2, the Sabbath, right? They keep the 7th day. Number 3, circumcision. So this is what the Jews do. And then they have fasting, I'm guessing Yom Kippur, right? Or maybe more, and new moons. New moons means that they determine their time according to lunar calendar, right? They look at the moon and then they decide when the month starts or ends. So we have about 5 things, a list of 5 things that this is what Jews do, right? And notice, by the way they're described, right? So scrupulosity, right? Superstition, fancies, right? The things are utterly ridiculous, right? They're stupid. The writer thinks this list is completely nonsensical and idiotic and stupid. This is how he calls it. But look at the circumcision. Jews boast about their circumcision. They're very proud of it, which the author finds very, very weird. And so that's his list. And he's saying, this is what the Jews are doing. And notice, by the way, it says unworthy of notice. I don't need to teach this to you. And then obviously, because it's unworthy of notice, this is what he's going to spend the rest of the letter to talk about, right? So we don't have to talk about this. And then he's going to talk about this. So what is he going to say about this list, right? So by the way, if I'm starting this class, and don't forget, we're trying to figure out what do Jews think, what makes a Jew and what makes a Christian Christian? When did these two religions separate? So theoretically, already in the 2nd century, we have this time and place where Jews do certain things and Christians don't. And the list of what the Jews do is a list we kind of are familiar with, right? Circumcision and kosher and Sabbath and lunar calendar. These are things we know that the Jews do and Christians don't. Now, by the way, why did we start in 2nd century? And we have to stop here for a second and talk a little bit about dates. Jesus lived and was crucified around the year 30, right? So where he lived in the beginning of the 1st century CE. His followers, Paul, his most famous follower, in the 50s. The Gospels talking about his life were written or composed about 70, 80, the end of the 1st century CE. When we get to the 2nd century, we get a text like that. And that text already defined what a Jew would do and a Christian is a Christian. Now, let's look at what he says about those things. Why are they so stupid according to him? 4, says the writer of this text, to accept some of those things which have been formed by God for the use of men as properly formed, and to reject others as useless and redundant. How can this be lawful? What is he talking about? Remember our list? What's the first thing we're talking about? Kashrut laws, right? So the writer says, this is totally idiotic. Why would God allow us to eat certain things and not others, right? Why can't we eat a chicken, but we can't eat, I don't know, a crocodile, or we can't eat a pig, right? This doesn't make any sense. Why would God create certain things we can eat and certain not? This is totally doesn't make any sense. And then to speak falsely of God as if he forbade us to do what is good on the Sabbath day, how is it not unpious? He says, listen, those Jews, they have laws on the Sabbath that they can't do certain things on the Sabbath that can be good. For example, driving to your parents on the Sabbath, or I don't know. We live in a world where, for example, you can break the Sabbath according to Orthodox law to save a life. This was not always the case, was not always obvious, right? So let's say someone is in a burning house. Can you save him? Can you not? What about books? Or can you do this or not? Can you heal someone on the Sabbath? That's a big one in the New Testament. Jesus is blamed for healing people on the Sabbath, and this is something that he comes out against the Pharisees of the time. So there's a lot of arguments about what can and cannot do on the Sabbath. And the writer of the text says, how can that be? The Jews say that there are good things that you can't do on the Sabbath. How can that be if the Sabbath is a good thing? So that's Sabbath, number 2. Then number 3 goes on in the list, and he says the following: and to glory in the circumcision of the flesh as if a proof of election, and as if on account of it they were especially beloved by God. How is it not a subject of ridicule? Says the writer in the world of Greco-Roman world, he said, listen, those Jews, they maimed themselves by taking the foreskin off their body, they harmed their body, and then they go around the world and say, this is the proof that we are better than anyone else. We are the chosen people by God. How is this not stupid, says the writer of this. This is circumcision, number 3 on our list. And then, as to their observing months and days, as if waiting upon the stars and the moon and the distribution according to their own tendencies, the appointment of God and the vicissitudes of the season, some for festivities and other for mourning, how would this seem part of a divine worship and not much a rather manifestation of folly? So says the writer, this whole lunar calendar where you have to go and look at the sky and wait for the moon to come out to declare the new moon, that everything is dependent on that the festivals and everything. How is this not a folly, says the writer of this. And then he finishes by, suppose that you're convinced by me that, there are the common ways of the Jews, and look at the language common to Jews and Gentile, from the busybody of the spirit and the boasting of the Jews, right? Okay, that's the text we open our class today, and the question we're asking. Okay, so Jews and Christians, separated or not? According to this, if we judge by this, very early on, already in the 2nd century, we have a very clear attitude towards Jews by this Christian writer saying, there's a list of things that Jews do and Christians don't. It's a very, very clear list. And that list, we say, is not a smart one. We ridicule that list. We think this is stupid. We think this is a folly, right? And we talk very negatively about the Jews. So if I have to paint a picture of Jewish-Christian relations according to this text, my answer is very simple. I started promising you complexity. This text is not complex, right? Jews and Christians are not friends. There is a very clear line between Jews and Christians, and that's about it. And they're not friends with each other. Okay, so we can finish our class here, can't we? Right? So that's our answer. 2nd century, clear list, not friends. Don't worry, I promise I'm gonna confuse you a little bit more. So this is a good place to start. We can also add to that, and I won't have a lot of time to go into that, but we can also add to that some passages in the New Testament, especially in the Gospel of John, which is the latest of the all 4 gospel, probably in the beginning of the 2nd century, somewhere around there, maybe end of the 1st century. And we have a few sentences in the Gospel of John that talk about the Jews wanting to kill Jesus, and very harsh language between Jews and Christians, suggesting that at this point already, the follower of Jesus and the Jews that they lived among them were not on good terms with each other. And lastly, and this is the guy I want to point out, especially because he's important in the history of the text, is a church father named Ignatius. And Ignatius of Antioch lives in the 2nd century, and he is an important one for our question because he is the first guy to talk about Christianity, the term. Because when we're looking at the New Testament, Jesus is actually portrayed as part of the Jewish milieu of Second Temple. He's a Jew he fights with the Pharisees and he asks questions, but the first person to talk about a group in a special name called Christianity is this guy, Ignatius. And this is what Ignatius says. He says the following: for if we continue to live in accordance with Judaism, we admit that we have not received grace. Throw out, therefore, the bad yeast, which has become stale and sour, and reach for the new yeast, which is Jesus Christ. It is utterly absurd. Listen carefully, this is an important statement. It's utterly absurd to profess Jesus Christ and practice Judaism. So it says Ignatius in the 2nd century and says, listen, you guys, we have to make a very clear line between Judaism and what we are. And then look at the word he just will use for the first time. For Christianity did not believe in Judaism. There's 2 different entities. They're Judaism and Christianity, and they don't mix. They can't go together. Has to be a separation between them. And whoever thinks that they can go together is very, very wrong. Now here I'm going to use my sticker metaphor. So in Israel, when you take the bus or you take the train, there's always, with those seats that face each other, there's like 4 seats, one facing each other. There's always a sticker saying, don't put your feet on the seat in front of you. Now, by the way, I don't think that sticker exists here in the United States. I haven't seen it on the train to New York from New Haven. And there is a reason for it. Why is there a sticker in Israel and there isn't here in the States? Because in Israel, most people put their feet on the seat in front of them. So there's a sticker telling them not to do it. Remember that. And let's read again. Ignatius, when Ignatius says, you people that think that you can believe in Jesus and practice Judaism, you are wrong. You can't. So this is what Ignatius says. But what do we hear? What's happening on the ground? The only reason he needs to say you cannot believe in Jesus and be Jewish is probably because there are people on the ground that he's talking to that do think so. Right? This is just like the sticker. You don't ask people not to put their feet on the seat if they're not doing it, right? So this is where I want to start looking at the complexity. So we see Ignatius, just like the writer of the text in the first one, saying Judaism and Christianity are very separate by the 2nd century. They have nothing to do with each other. That's the writer of the text that's saying a very clear thing. But all of a sudden we hear something about the people he's talking to on the ground. So when I'm asking about Jewish-Christian relation, we have to start thinking about 2 different dimensions. There is the speaker, who's trying to create a very clear line between Judaism and Christianity, so much so that Ignatius comes up with the term Christianity, or he's the first to use it. And there's the people he's talking to. And that's going to be important for the text I'm going to show you today, because a lot of the time from the text, we kind of figure, we can learn that the people he's talking to think differently about what he's saying. It looks like there were people in the time of Ignatius that thought that you could believe in Jesus and practice Judaism. Okay, that's interesting. So we have the speaker who are the writer of the first text, Ignatius, who are painting a very clear picture of what the Jews do and Christians don't do. Don't forget our list of things that Jews do. And then we have this like hints that on the ground, something a little bit different is happening. Okay, so far so good. This is on the Christian side. When we're looking at Jesus in the Talmud to start and look for clues for how Jews and Christians do on the rabbinic side, a very obvious place to start is where Jesus is mentioned in the Talmud. Now, before I start talking about that, I have to talk a little bit about the text itself. How do I know what the Jews are saying about Jesus? I actually have, in this case, I have to go and look at manuscript because the printed edition censored these when the Talmud was printed in the 16th century. These texts were written out and they were censored, and rightly so, because there are some not so pleasant things said about Jesus in the text, and they were taken out. And this is one of them that I want to talk about, is that, for example, one of the texts, when they're trying to talk about Jesus, and so we have a story, a very famous story in Gita, tractate Gita. Notice here, this is in the manuscript Munich. You have Jesus here, and it's not in the printed text. The name of Jesus is not mentioned there. It just says that man. It doesn't say Jesus because someone censored it out. But the texts tell us that this guy named Onkelos, when he wanted to convert to Judaism, he didn't want to take any chances. So he kind of like raised from the dead a few people and asked them what they're doing. And one of the people he asked is Jesus. And he says, listen, what's happening in the next world? Who's important? And Jesus tells him, Jews, you should really convert, really. Then the next world, they win. But then he's like, well, while we're talking, can you tell me what's happening with you? And he says to him, what is your punishment? And he says, I am in hell, basically. What am I doing? I'm sitting in boiling excrement. So the rabbis imagine Jesus to be sitting in boiling excrement in the afterworld. So to kind of summarize what we've seen so far, if I have to talk about Jews and Christians' relations in the 1st century CE, we looked at Christian texts talking about Jews, and I brought an example of a rabbinic text in the Babylonian Talmud, redacted around the 6th or 7th century, but has tradition going back to, could be anywhere from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century CE, talking about Jesus. And now when I want to ask, what was the connection between Jews and Christian? We can pretty much say that it wasn't a nice one, right? We had the text from the 2nd century, Christian text talking about Jews and giving us a list of what the Jews do, the Christian don't, and also saying things about Judaism that's not very nice. And then we talked about a rabbinic text talking about Jesus and not being very nice about Jesus either. So that led to what we used to call in scholarship the parting of the ways. Meaning, when we were talking about Judaism and Christianity, there was an assumption, a scholarly assumption, of a moment in time when those two religions parted ways, somewhere around the 2nd century, maybe Bar Kokhba revolt, 135, around that time when this text, Ignatius writes this text, when there was one religion, and then at some point something happens, and those two religions separates into two separate religion, like we see in the picture. That's what we call the parting of the ways. And then scholarship started asking, when did that moment happen? Why did it happen at that time? What made Judaism and Christianity? So that's what we call the parting of the ways. What's the problem with this metaphor in this picture that we're looking at? That it doesn't work. Because this has to assume that there was a single religion before, that there was a specific event that happened that made those two, and then that from then on, those two religions lived separately. I'm going to spend the rest of my time, the other half hour of this talk, try to show you that this doesn't work. But we're going to take a break now of a few minutes to start looking at a few of the questions that you've sent before we move on to the next question, the next section of the talk, which is going to be a little bit more complicated. So let me take a look at your Q&A and look at some of those questions that people have raised. Matt, am I looking? There we go. Some questions are answered. I don't know who answered those questions. There we go. I'm looking, Matt, I'm just looking at the open ones.
You can either the opened, and there's a couple that got moved to a different tab that says answered, but both of those, no questions have been answered. So
Okay.
any that you want to answer at this
So
time.
let me look some of those questions. Note, said Stephen Lamb. Note that the 2nd century statement by Mathetes, right, the friend, is about their forms of worship and not that their God is different from our God. Very interesting point that when we're talking about Judaism and Christianity, we should make a difference between beliefs and praxis. Very, very good point. And I'm going to use that point when I'm going to show you the complexity that start being on the ground. So that's a very good comment. Thank you. Interesting that Jesus Christ is referred to as yeast, a raging agent, which would prohibited during Pesach. Do you think this was intentional? That's interesting. Well, Jesus has a very strong ties to Passover, of course, and the lamb of Passover so there's a lot of imagery doing that. The yeast here is actually has something to do with how Christianity looked at itself in relationship to the Judaism that came before that. And there is something that has to do with leftovers from the past that we've developed into the new Israel. So there's a few metaphors that Christianity uses. There's a tree and leaves, and there's roots, and there's yeast, right? There's like the beginning of it, but yeast can go bad. So, right. So how do you go to a new yeast? So this is one of the metaphors. It's very complicated and needs a lot more explaining to read Christian theology, but it's a good point to notice that. What is the symbolism of a lion, the picture of Ignatius? That's a very good point. And I really am not an expert in art, but lions actually appear a lot in church fathers' pictures. This has to do with strength and the metaphor of that, but also some of their ability of some of those sages to converse with animals. It's very, very interesting. Not the topic at all of our talk today. So we're not going to go there. Was there criticism of those declaring the religion of Jesus had stupid laws? Was there criticism of those declaring the religion of Jesus? I can't, Amelia Leibovich, I can't kind of figure out the syntax of this question. But if you're asking if there's similar claims that Christian beliefs were as stupid as Jews, yes, there was. And we have some text like that from Dialogue with Trifle, for example. So we can actually try to relive the dialogue between them. The only problem we have, and that's the problem I always deal with, is that Christian texts are much earlier than Jewish texts. So sometimes I have to reconstruct the Jewish text from the earlier Christian text. I think I'm going to stop. Will the slide be made available? The talk is being recorded and you can look at the slide later. I'm going to stop with the question now. Please feel free to ask more questions. I'm going to leave a half an hour at the end of my talk for more questions and we'll do more. But now I want to move to more text and make everything what we've done now much more complicated. We're not going to end the day feeling good with ourselves. This is going to be complicated and this is on purpose. So let's do some more slides. So the first guy I want to introduce you to is this guy, Eusebius of Caesarea. Now, by the way, every time I show you a picture of church fathers. Do not think they look like that. These are later depiction of them, how people thought that they should look like, right? So this is Eusebius. And Eusebius is very important because Eusebius writes a church history. It doesn't talk about Jews in this case at all. He's talking about Christians. And he's confronting a very horrible accusation against the Christians. You know, the Christians, they have a ceremony called the Eucharist, where they have like the Lord's meal, where they drink wine, and this is likened to, or the actual blood of Jesus, and they eat bread, which is the body of Christ. Now, this sounds very strange to the Romans around the Greco-Roman world around them. And rumor starts going around that Christians they're cannibals, they eat blood and they eat flesh. So they accused Christians of eating the blood of children. Sounds familiar to you? This was an accusation against the Jews as well, but this was also an accusation against a Christian. Everything that you learn about religion in the ancient world leads to the conclusion that there's nothing new under the sun. And accusations are always the same. But in this case, they accused the Christian of eating blood. And Eusebius answered that in the 3rd century, and he says the following: how would such men eat children when they are not allowed to eat the blood of even of irrational animals? So Eusebius says, listen, we've been accused of eating the blood of children, of Greco-Roman children, but it doesn't make any sense because, says Eusebius, those Christians don't eat the blood of irrational animals. So they can't, in fact, by the laws, eat the blood of children. So Eusebius is not talking about Jews, he's talking about Christian, and he's saying that Christians of his time observe some kind of dietary laws. They keep kosher in some way. Wait a second. Did we not just start half an hour ago this conversation by saying that Jews are the ones that keep kosher and not Christians? And it doesn't make any sense to keep dietary laws. But all of a sudden we see a Christian church father saying to us that Christians observe dietary laws. They keep kosher. You don't eat the blood of irrational animals. What's happening here? And yes, I'm going to take the entire list and try to show you that if you look at different texts in different times, that list makes no sense in actual time. Different Christian communities observe certain practices of Jews in different times. So this is one of them. Kosher, not just Jewish, not all Christian maybe, because the writer of the 2nd century text that we started with don't eat kosher and he thinks that's stupid, but Eusebius is talking about Christian keeping kosher. Let's do one more. This is like my favorite writer of ancient time. His name is John Chrysostomus. He lived in Constantinople in the 4th and the beginning of the 5th century. And his name, Chrysostomus, means the mouth of gold, right? He's a great speaker, has great practice in oratory. And look at what he's doing. So he's giving a speech, a sermon, and his church to his Christian followers. These are all Christians in his church, and he's giving a speech, and he's saying the following: another serious illness calls for any cure my words can bring, an illness which has become implanted in the body of the church. So he's very grave, right? He stands in front of his church. Imagine, church filled with Christians. And he's very, very serious and very glum. And he says, there is a serious illness in our church. Speaking to a Christian, what's the disease? Why is he so upset? And he says, what's the disease? The festivals of the pitiful and miserable Jews are soon to march upon us one after another and in quick succession. We should imagine him in about, beginning of September. And he's saying, and I love that description, everyone who's tried to keep the Jewish holidays knows that the festivals are coming in succession, one after the other, is a very, very, familiar description of the Jewish holidays. And he said, the Jewish holidays are about to dawn upon us. Again, he's a Christian church father standing in a church and talking to his Christian audience. And he's talking about the Jewish festivals. What's happening here? And look at the list. Feast of the Trumpets. What holiday is that? Rosh Hashanah, right? The shofar. The Feast of the Tabernacle. What is that? Sukkot, right? With the booths. And the fasts. Yom Kippur, right? And maybe another fast. I'm not going to drop that this at this moment. But he knows the Jewish holidays very, very well. And he says they're about to start. So why is he so upset about the Jewish holidays in his church, to his Christian community? And he's saying the following. There are many in our ranks who say they think as we do. Many people sitting in this room, Christian card-holding members, they say that they're Christian, yet some of these are going to watch the festivals and other will join the Jews in keeping their feasts and observing their fasts. Opa, that's interesting. Some members of his church watch the festivals. They go to the synagogue and hear the trumpets, right? They go into the booths to see the festivals that the Jews do. And some of them observes and join the Jews in keeping feasts. They eat the Rosh Hashanah meal. They go to the synagogue and the fast. They fast on Yom Kippur. So Chrysostomus is talking to his very Christian audience, in which some of the people in his audience fast on Yom Kippur, observe Rosh Hashanah, sit in a booth in Sukkot, even though they call themselves Christians. Did we not just say, did we not have a list from 2nd century where the Jews keep lunar calendar, the Jews do kosher, and all of a sudden we have a Christian community in the 4th and 5th century observing Jewish holidays, a Christian community. What's happening here? And again, notice what we saw before. We have two different Christian audiences, right? We have the speaker, which is Chrysostomus, who's very upset and want to keep those two religions separate. And we have the people on the ground, his audience, right? The Christians going into the church who do something very different. They are putting their feet on the seat in front of them. They're going into the synagogue. They're doing Rosh Hashanah. They're fasting on Yom Kippur. They're participating in the festival of booth. What's happening? So Chrysostomus is very, very upset. And he says, if they hear no word from me today, they will then join the Jews in their fast and they will commit the sin and it would be useless for me to apply the remedy. Don't do that. Why? Because the Jews, says Chrysostomus, they gather rabble, effeminate men and prostitutes as they drag the crowds from the theaters and the actors to the synagogue. He's like, those who go with them, they're the worst of us. They're effeminate men. That's the worst of the worst, says Chrysostomus. They're prostitutes and the crowds that go to the theaters. These are the people that the Jews influence in going into their synagogue. If that's the truth, these are the people that the Jews managed to convince, why are you so upset? Why are you so upset? Is that true? Is that really only the people that the Jews managed to convince? Or is this a real problem to you in your community? I kind of think it's the latter, because he's dedicating this long ceremony to telling everyone, don't go. It looks like a real problem to him. I'm going to skip this a little bit because I'm going to, you know what? I don't want to skip this because it's too good. Chrysostomus continues in another story. And he says the following, and he says, listen, I'm going into the street 3 days ago, says Chrysostomus, and I saw a noble or free woman who is modest and faithful being forced into a synagogue by a coerced and senseless person who appeared to be a Christian. And he forced her into a synagogue to make an oath about certain business matters which were in litigation. So what's happening? He goes in the street, and then he sees this woman being dragged into a synagogue, a Christian woman being dragged by Christian men into a synagogue. And later on, he says they passed by a church and they didn't go in, and they went especially into a synagogue. Why are they going into a synagogue? And Chrysostomus asked them, and apparently they're about to sign a lease. They about to sign something in litigation. They're about to sign a contract, and they want to make this stick. It's kind of like today when you shake hand on a contract, right? You make this, we make this official, we shake hand. This litigation, this contract is signed in a synagogue. Why? Because he asked the Christian, and look at what the Christian says. And he says, I asked the abductor whether he was a Christian, and if it was, and I reproached him, why did you go in? And I asked him why he had by a church and dragged the woman specifically to place in the Hebrews. And look what the Christian guy says. He replied that many has told him that the oath which we're taking there were more awesome. They were more binding. So we have an example on the ground of Christian men and women believing that oaths taken at the synagogue were more meaningful and more special and more binding than in a church. Again, Chrysostomus goes nuts. He doesn't want his Christian people going into synagogues, but there is. So we have the leader, John Chrysostomus, yelling, keep apart, don't go in. But we have evidence from his stories about how the people do Christianity in his time. And people do Christianity by also celebrating the fast with the Jews, also going to a synagogue to sign contracts, keeping kosher according to Eusebius. Few more examples before we stop for a second and talk a little bit this. I'm kind of like, I don't know if you're noticing this, but I'm skipping between the genre of literature in this talk. We started with a letter. We move into a church sermon. In a second, we'll do a story, which I really like. But I want to skip now to law, canons of law. Art mentioned I'm going to be at Harvard Law School next semester in the fall, and I'm going to concentrate primarily on law corpora. And this is some of the texts I'm going to teach. When you look at the laws that talk about Jews and Christians in the ancient time, these are interesting. And I brought you a few examples of laws from around different geographical areas. So look at the first one. This is from Syria in the 4th century. And look at this canon of law. This is a Christian canon of law of what people should do or not do. And look at that. If any bishop, presbyter, or deacon, or any of the list of clergy keeps fast or festival with the Jews, or receives from them any of the gifts of their feast as unleavened bread, any such thing, let them be deposed. And if he a layman, let them be excommunicated. So this law says the following: members of the leadership of the church, if you guys keep the festivals with the Jews, fast with the Jews, or receive gifts from them, and look at the example they're bringing, and that example repeats again and again in many. If you receive matzah from them, I always say that I don't get that. I never got that. Why would they want to do matzah? So I know that matzah is, this was the last meal of Jesus, and Passover is very directly tied to Jesus and Easter, etc. Very important. But matzah, it tastes like feet. And I don't understand why they would want to eat that until I got to the United States. And I found out that almost every supermarket has this like aisle of kosher stuff, like a few kosher products, and there's matzahs there sold year round. And they're actual people who buy them, but they don't have to. So very strange to me. Don't get it, but okay. And every time I say that in one of times, there's always someone in the back that raises their hand and say, no, matzah is really good. And I look at them respectfully and roll my eyes. But in any case, apparently that's a very ancient tradition to receive gifts. You would get like a basket of matzahs from the Jews to eat. And that's a thing. And everyone's doing it. And again, remember my sticker example. You don't make a law. Don't fast with the Jews. Don't do the feast with the Jews. Don't get matzah from the Jews unless people are actually doing it. And who's doing it? We have actual members of the clergy, bishop, presbyters, deacons, right? That are doing it, not just lay people. And that's very, very upsetting to whoever writes the law because they need to be excommunicated. But their only reason to do it is because people are actually doing it. So we have evidence from Syriac in the 1st century that this was a thing. Let's look at Turkey in the 4th century. It is not lawful to receive portions sent from the feast of the Jews, not to feast together with them. They're doing this with the Jews. It is not lawful to receive unleavened bread from the Jews, again, the matzah, nor to partake of their impiety, right? Look at canon number 29. Christians must not Judaize by resting on the Sabbath, but must work on that day, honoring the Lord's Day. Wait a second. Did we not see a text in the 2nd century listing Sabbath as one of the things that only Jews do and Christians don't? What is happening here in Turkey in the 4th century? A Christian law yelling at Christians, do not rest on the Sabbath? Again, apparently, some Christians rest on the Sabbath. I don't know if you're noticing, I'm kind of like destroying the list one by one and showing you that the list that supposedly makes a difference between Jews and Christian is not so when you look at the text. Things are complicated. If you read different texts from different time periods into different geographical areas, you will see the things on the ground were complicated. Jews and Christians were much more closely intertwined with each other as what some writers of the text would want us to believe. Much more complicated than that. Look at the Spain one from the 4th century. Landlords are not to allow Jews to bless the crops they have received from God and from which they are offered thanks. Apparently in Spain in the 4th century, every farmer would call a Jew to bless his crops, right? He would call the Jews to make a blessing on them. What's happening? Look how closely and how intertwined they were with one another all over in different geographical areas and different time periods. And lastly, and this is something that I want to, we'll do, I can't let lastly. One more and two more. We'll do two more. This is a story, martyrdom. We skip to the 5th or 6th century in the Persian Empire. This is a martyrdom, a story about a guy being killed and persecuting the Christian. Has nothing to do with the Jews. Story about the Christian being persecuted. And the story about this martyrdom tells us that the Christian were persecuted by the Persian, and they're coming after them and killing them all, and they hide in the church. They go all together and they hide together in the church. And the writer of this text says the following, and there was an occasion for the evil ones, and then he says the following: the church, our church, was filled with the uncircumcised. And instead of the sound of prayer, I heard the sound of upheaval and persecuted. And he says, listen, because of this mess and everything that's happening, our church is filled with uncircumcised, which is not us. And the church is filled with this. Wait a second. He's saying about other people that they're uncircumcised as opposed to us Christians in our church, which are circumcised. So according to this text in the 5th and 6th century in the Persian Empire, we have evidence of Christian being circumcised. I don't know if you've noticed, but I've kind of showed you examples of a lot of Christians doing the exact opposite of the very clear list. This is what the Jews do and Christians don't. I just went one by one showing you texts of Christians being circumcised, Christian keeping Sabbath, Christian keeping fast and feast according to lunar calendar, Christian keeping kosher. And more than that, Christian going into synagogues to make oaths, Jews coming to bless Christian crops. I showed you, in fact, a variety of texts. We went through a lot of texts in this past hour to show that things on the ground were complicated. We had people trying to dictate a certain amount of distance, and we had the people on the ground acting differently. Complicated. I'm gonna stop because I want to do something nice for us and to leave this, but I see that everything has turned dark, and I'm going to turn the light on in my room. Sorry. I think this is needed. There we go. Or let there be light. Let me know if it's not too matte, if it's not too bright in the eye. Is that okay? Matt? Yeah? Okay. And I want to finish with this text because I want to do something a little bit more optimistic also. And this is a very, very, very interesting testimony that we have from a church father named Suzomen. And Suzomen writes in the 5th century and tell us a very, very, very interesting custom. And he says the following: the inhabitants of the country and of the regions around Palestine, the Phoenicians and the Arabs, assemble annually at Mamre. Where is Mamre? Mamre is where Hebron is. Hebron in Israel. And we're told that everyone gathers together in this place in Mamre during the summer season. We don't know when exactly. And actually, we don't have any other evidence for a holiday at that time period, but apparently there was, to keep a brilliant feast, right? We should imagine something very festive. Many others, both buyers and sellers, resort there on account of the fair, right? So it brings together sellers and buyers. We should hear the cacophony of noises, and everyone's coming together to celebrate what? Indeed, this feast is diligently frequented by all nations. So he's telling us about a feast that everyone's do together, all the nations. Why? The Jews, because they both of their descent from the patriarch Abraham. So the Jews like this, and they do this holiday because Abraham was from Mamre, from this area. That's the Jews. The pagans, because angel there appeared to men. So apparently Greco-Roman tradition or pagans have a tradition of angels appearing in this place and they come. And Christians, because he who has lately revealed himself through the Virgin for the salvation of mankind, once appeared there to the pious men. So apparently we have this like sacred space that is sacred to all religion. So what do you do when you have a sacred place like that? I live in a country where we have a few contested places like that. So now we have a solution in the 5th century. And then in the 5th century, apparently, there was a holiday in the summer where all religion came together. And look at the description of it. Some pray to God of all. Some call upon the angel. Some pour out wine or burn incense or often an ox or a he-goat or a sheep or a cock. This is like a description, like, again, I can almost hear the cacophony of it. Everyone's doing their own thing. One plays to the angels, one do like a libation of wine, and there's like a sacrifice of goats and a sheep and a cock, and then you see like a noise of all gathered together, each to celebrate their own holiday, but they all come together in this one place. And obviously, as men do, all abstain from coming near their wife. They're all shared. The sexism is all shared by all. But in any case, I think this is why I like to end my talk with this text, because this is a really cool example. You want to separate Judaism and Christianity? That wasn't the case on the ground. There was even shared worship together on purpose and a holiday in a shared place that was sacred to all. Fine. Consumerism at its best. We have merchants and we have buyers and we have fun and we have sacrifices and we have everyone, coming together and celebrating together, which I think is kind of a Psalmistic and maybe a good model that we need to think more and adapt more when we're thinking about contested sacred spaces. But again, showing us, and this is where I want to stop and kind of start to summarize what we saw today, and with all the different texts that we read and reach a different conclusion that I wanted to reach, is that when we're talking about the ancient times, and we're talking about the question of Jews and Christians, when we're talking about the separation between Judaism and Christianity, and when did it happen, and how did it happen, the answer is, it's complicated. That's the answer. We have very early texts talking about separation, and them being very different from one another, and not knowing, not coming not coming in touch with each other. There's a list of things that Jews do and Christians don't, and they don't come next to each other, and you can't believe in Jesus and being Jewish. That's very early on. But then we have different texts. We have texts in a sermon in a church yelling at the Christians, don't fast on Yom Kippur, don't go to the festival of the booths. We have testimony of Christian getting matzahs from the Jews. We have testimony of the Christian circumcising. We have evidence of Christian keeping kosher, some kind of dietary laws. We have evidence of Jews blessing crops. We have evidence of Christian going into churches and going into synagogues and swearing an oath over a litigation, over a contract, because this is considered more awesome. We have laws, we have stories about joint holidays, we have church sermons, we have letters, we have different literary genre. We have a history, right? This is Eusebius telling us in a history book, all kinds of literary evidence from different genre of literature, from different time period, from different geographical region, testifying to a speaker that tried to make a differentiation, or people on the ground acting differently, or even speakers telling us about a complex picture on the ground. Jews in the 1st century CE were Jews and Christians were as far as possible from the image of a one road splitting into two separate ways. The parting of the ways metaphor doesn't work with anything that we know from the text that I've just read to you. Even when we hear texts that talk about separation, it's fighting against a situation on the ground which was not as simple as that. People were much more in touch, much more in context, much more intertwined with each other than we give them credit for. And the sources tell us that they were in touch, they knew about each other, they talked to each other, they were in conversation with each other. And that's where we need to start the history lesson. So when did Judaism and Christianity separate? The answer is, it's complicated. Let's read the sources. Let's read them one by one and ask where and when and in what way and what does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be a Jewish? It's complicated. They had close contact, much closer than we give them credit for. And now we have to start asking ourselves, what did it do to the two religious community once we know that they didn't separate in the 2nd century into two separate religions? No, they didn't. They were much more in touch than we give them credit. And now we need to ask, what did it do to each religious community in itself when we know that they were in touch with each other, when we know that they had interaction and that they in practice and in theology as well, what did it do to each religion? The fact that they were much more closely intertwined than we give them credit for. This is me for now. Thank you for everyone for listening. And now we have time, I think, about a half an hour for questions. And I see there's a lot of questions. So let me see some of them. Wow. Okay. Okay, let's start. Matt, which one should I read?
If it's helpful, I can ask some of them to you to get us started.
Let's go.
Okay. There's a number of questions I've noticed in the list that are about the Nicene Council, with and that you haven't addressed that sort of moment in time. I don't know if that people are wondering, as that like more of like a separation, a larger separation point in this complex story. If there's anything you want to say about that.
Wait, can you ask the question again?
Sorry, there's a number of people who have just asked about the Nicene Council and what happened during
the word
that.
Nicene. You got cut off when you say Nicene, so I was like missing like the Nicene Council.
Yeah, sorry about that. So just if you have any comments on
okay,
what happened there.
So let's talk a little bit about that. So I kind of spoke about the crucifixion of Jesus in the year 30, but there is a few events in the history of Christianity that are important for the question of the pardoning of the way. So the first one is Jesus, right? Jesus' life. He was born about the year -4, crucified the year 30. We talked a little bit about his followers. This is 1st century CE. There's a few other events. At this point, Christianity is not legal in the Roman Empire. This is a new religion. They don't know exactly what to do with it. 2nd, 3rd century. Persecution of the Christian, not very clear how widespread it was, but it wasn't allowed to be a Christian, but were they persecuted? How much were they persecuted? It's a good question. That's called a debate. But then this guy comes into the floor of the history, Constantine. And Constantine in the 4th century, beginning of the 4th century, makes Christianity legal. It's really interesting why he does that. He was a very savvy political leader. He might have figured out, and this is some cynical scholars think that he did this for political reason. The Roman Empire were kind of like becoming to fall apart, and he decides and uses the Christian religion as a unifying factor. So he starts by making, or maybe he had a change of heart and he does convert to Christianity. So that's a good question. But in any case, he starts by making Christianity legal, and then makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And that's a crucial moment in history. It's kind of like the seal of approval of Christianity winning, basically. It actually won before that because Constantine chooses Christianity because it's the winner on the ground. But this is really a stamp of approval. This is when Christianity really wins the day and becomes the most important religion of the ancient world, of the Western world. And but then he has a problem, because he wants Christianity to be the official religion, but there isn't such a thing as Christianity. There's many, many Christianities, right? There's many groups believing in different things. And especially one of the most important questions, there's a Trinity and there's a Father and the Son. And what's the connection between the Father and the Son, right? Is it the same? Is the Son the same as the Father? Is he also a God? Was he ever a man? Like all kind of really, really difficult theological questions. So what he does is he convenes a few meetings of church leaders and thinkers, and one of the most famous one is Nicaea. And in that meeting, he gets all the Christian leaders together and he puts them in there and he's like, decide, what does Christianity believes in? Right? What's the right way? What's the orthodox way of Christianity? And they discuss and they vote on it and they kind of decide what Christianity is. Literally by a show of hands, right? After all this discussion, and they kind of like decide theology in this way. And it's a very important moment in time because it's kind of like the creation of the Orthodox Christianity or the mainstream Christianity. Obviously, it doesn't work so well. And there's still other groups that believe different things, and the Church of the East and the Church of the West, and there's all kinds of like different ways, and there's many other councils that follow, or long as they're famous or not. But this is a very important moment in time. So that's about that. And it does talk about the relationship between Christianity and its other religion, Judaism, etc. And this is part of it. And the question is, rabbinic literature comes from this around the same time period. Does it bear evidence to those changes happening in the Roman Empire? Do we see evidence in rabbinic literature to those changes when Christianity becomes this major force? So far, so good. We're talking about the Church of the West, but what happens in the East, where the Babylonian Talmud was redacted? What happens to Christianity there? Eastern Christianity and Syriac Christianity. All of that is super interesting, and this is exactly what I asked in my work. So my work focused on the Babylonian Talmud, and this is the previous talk I gave at the Haberman Institute, is that I gave a talk about heretic narratives, and this is a story in the Talmud, and I try to claim that the Talmud does portray evidence of different arguments that's happening in the Christian world, and the rabbis know about this and talk about this and engage in it, and they're anxious about it and to polemicize about it, and this is a lot of fun to try to answer that question. Matt, do you want to ask another question?
Sure, yeah. There's a few questions also, and I'm going to combine them for you, but about the origins of the followers of Jesus and maybe Jesus himself, and also rabbinic Judaism as we have it, as it developed today. Like what came before those groups?
Good. So if I put this a little bit differently, the question is, when we're talking about Judaism and Christianity, it kind of started in the 2nd century, and I didn't start in the time of Jesus. And the reason I didn't start in the time of Jesus, because there is a consensus when we look at it from a critical point of view that does not say that Jesus was Christian. In fact, in fact, Jesus, and this is very clearly the way he's portrayed even in the gospel talking about him, which again were written 50 years after he was already crucified, still describe the gospel, Matthew, Luke, Mark, even John, describe Jesus as a Jew. And that's very, very interesting. And here I'm going to reference a very important source for the study of Second Temple Judaism, which is The Life of Brian, a movie by Monty Python. Highly, highly recommend, because it really shows what Second Temple Judaism, the period where Jesus came to be, was like. There were many kinds of Judaisms around, and there were arguments constantly. This is what we call sectarianism. A lot of groups, each claiming, I am the real Jews, I'm the correct Jews, and the Qumran people, and the Pharisees, and the Sadducees, and Essenes, and we have the Zealots, and we have the scribes, and we have the teachers of the law, and we have the Jesus movement, and we have John the Baptist, and we have many, many figures going around, and each talking about theology and eschatology and the angelology, and we have all kind of groups living at the same time. And this is where Jesus comes to be. But he is part of this mess of Second Temple Judaisms, and he is born into that. And the gospel tells us he goes around the temple. He's part of the temple worship. He talks about circumcision, and he talks about the Sabbath, and he's talking about the Jewish things that all the Jews talk about. And he argues, like other groups argue as well. So the New Testament actually presents Jesus to us as part of his milieu, as part of this milieu of Second Temple Judaism. So this is about Jesus and his followers. So this is what we call the Jesus movement. We don't call them Christians, we call them the Jesus movement. When we talk about Christianity, and then it gets complicated. When does we start calling them Christians and what kind of Christians, etc. But at this point, the first century, it's hard to talk about Christianity, and we need to talk about the Jesus movement or Paul and his communities, etc. So this is why we're careful about that. Another thing that we need to talk, when I talked about the ways that parted, I kind of like focus in this class about what happens after the parting, right? Is it two separate ways or are they intertwined? But even the one way, right, where Judaism was split, what is that Judaism? Is it biblical Judaism? And if that's the case, if biblical Judaism is the beginning, and from there, rabbinic Judaism and Christianity separated, that's a problem to us, because rabbinic Judaism is not the same as biblical Judaism. It has, I don't know, many different laws and much more elaborate laws than the Bible does. Judaism in the Bible doesn't look like rabbinic Judaism. It's something much more developed, a little bit different or a lot different. And we see rabbinic Judaism only in the beginning, starting in texts that were redacted at the end of the 2nd century. So in fact, if you want to ask the question, what came before that? The New Testament gospel come before the Mishnah in terms of chronology. Now, it's true that the Mishnah does hold, in the Mishnah, which is the first rabbinic text, does hold text going back to 1st and 2nd century, but it is a later text in its redaction, the final redaction. So where does rabbinic Judaism come from? It's a good question because it develops further from, Second Temple Judaism develops from the early Judaism that was in the Bible, but early Christianity too. So in fact, we like to talk about sister religion or some kind of religion basically developing side by side and not one flowing from the other, which is not correct because rabbinic Judaism is not the same as biblical Judaism. So we have biblical Judaism and then Second Temple Judaism with all its messes and cults and different sects and groups. And then we have the two movements, the Christianity and rabbinic Judaism, which developed in fact side by side. And that's a much more interesting picture to paint. So this is about the origin of rabbinic Judaism and the origin of Christianity.
Great, thank you. Again, I'm going to sort of combine a number of questions together here, but there's many questions about how Judaism and Christianity affected each other. And I sort of begin with that question because many people are wondering if there's a date in time that scholars hold as sort of the final separation point. And like, the reason I ask how interactions affected each other were there like different beliefs that each one over time held separately as their own tradition. And then there's a point at which scholars say, okay, like Jesus, a belief in Jesus as the Messiah, that's a belief that's a separation point, or if other practices or like beliefs that become those separation points.
So your question actually is combined from two different ones. One is the question that we actually asked and before we stopped in the middle, that someone asked, I don't remember the name of the person asked, a very good question that I'm kind of like focused on praxis in my talk, right? I gave a lot of examples about practical matters, kosher, feasts, fasts, circumcision, Sabbath, right? These are things of practical law. And someone asked, what about theology, right? So what's the difference in theology between Judaism and Christianity? And believe me or not, there it's complicated too, because believing in a Messiah is not a Christian thing. When Jesus proclaimed, or his followers proclaimed him as the Messiah in Second Temple Judaism, that's not Jewish. In 132, 135, we have the Bar Kokhba revolt, and we have evidence of Jews proclaiming Bar Kokhba to be a Messiah. That's the most famous example, but we have other Messiahs as well, looking for, messianic figures or the sons of light in Qumran people, and we have all kinds of like leaders that are believed to be saviors. That's something, son of God, which appears in the New Testament, also appears the term, but appear in the Qumran people. This is not Christian. So Jesus or someone else, this is something that's not. What about other beliefs? How do you read the Bible? What do you think about charity? What do you think about repentance? What do you think about asceticism? These are theological issues. Should you work or should you just study, right? Study worship versus worship. All kinds of questions that are in fact shared by those religions. Do they really think very differently from one another about those issues? You can hear from my tone that the answer is it's complicated. They take the Old Testament and they argue over biblical interpretation, but they also talk about theology that emanates from that. And sometimes they agree. And they know that the Christians think a certain way and they agree. And sometimes they disagree and they say, no, not true. You see a lot of argument about who God loves more. Did God abandon the Jews and went to the Christians? That's something that we see often in rabbinic literature. But these are kinds of questions about theology and, relationship between God and his people that are very much there. And that's also complicated because it's not clear at all what makes a Christian in terms of beliefs and what makes a Jew a Jew. Yes, the belief specifically in Jesus as the Messiah, that's interesting. But even that, again, believe in a messianic figure is not specifically Christian, right? So that's a question. Your second question, right? So that's about beliefs versus practice. Your second question is about, well, at some point there is Christianity and Judaism. When did it end? When did we can start talking about enough complexity? This is Christians and this is Jews. That's the question. And the answer to that is, I can say that it could be in the 2nd century because Ignatius tells us so. The Jews and Christian cannot be. Chrysostomus, when he's talking to his community, he's talking to Christians that declare themselves as Christians. If it's a self-definition thing, those Christians fasting on Yom Kippur, they declare themselves to be Christians. So what does it mean to be Christian and what does it mean to be Jewish is in fact complicated. And we can't say, so we can say that there's Christianity from the 2nd century. The question is, what does it mean to be Christian and what does it mean to be Jewish, right? It's kind of like asking you if a Jew has a Hanukkah bush or if he has a Christmas tree in his house, is he no longer a Jew? If he marries a non-Jew, is he no longer a Jew? Different answers are given to that in the Jewish traditions, right? Different during tradition today. So what does it mean to be a Jew today, right? Isn't that a question we're still asking? Same thing about the separation of Judaism and Christianity. If it's a description thing, from the 2nd century, we have description of Christian being Christians and Jews being Jews. That's something that's very early on being defined. What does it mean? What's the content of being a Christian or what is the content of being a Jew? My answer is, it's complicated. I'm kind of considering this as the title of my book. I'm not sure I'm going to go with that, but I'm kind of leaning towards calling it, it's complicated. I don't know if it's going to sell as much as it could. I have to fight with Cambridge University Press about that one, but we'll see.
Sounds like a good title to me. To sort of keep the complication or continue this conversation of complication, there's a number of questions broadly. How is this conversation, or is this conversation relevant to Jewish-Christian relations today, or world religions? And also, more specifically, there's a lot, like you mentioned, there's a lot of fluidity between defining who is a Jew and Christian potentially even today, and then some examples such as Messianic Judaism and crypto Jews, and I don't know if scholarship has thoughts on this, or if you have thoughts on these two pieces.
So I first have to put out a disclaimer here. I am very grateful to be dealing with texts of people who are long dead. I am very happy about that because I don't have to, deal with people disagreeing with what I say about the past, which is nice. I have enough of that from my colleagues, and so not from the people I'm talking about. But I can't ignore the fact that I'm a Jew living in this world, and I care very deeply about the world we live in, and I'm very worried about the world we live in. I don't know if you're following what's happening in Israel, and I'm extremely worried about democracy in Israel and where it's headed and the dangers that are posed by our current government. And this is tied very directly to Judaism. and how it's used, how it's presented by certain fragment of the government that uses Judaism and our culture as a way to harm certain groups, me included, women and gays and others, and so I can't ignore the fact that what I teach and what I learn has direct ramification of the world we live in. The government in Israel now actually claims to be settling some or offering some laws according to the actual Talmud, 15-year-old Talmud that I brought examples from, and they want to reenact them. So it actually has actual ramification of the world we live in. Same thing about Jewish-Christian interaction. When I, as a Jew, need to live in a world with Christians next to me, and how do Jews and Christians interact with each other, it has direct ramification from the past, right? This is direct continuation of that. And the Vatican, for example, has dealt with a lot of issues. There's a council that deals with Jewish-Christian relations, and I visited the Vatican and had discussion with them. This is a very, very important topic. We can't ignore the place that the church had during the Holocaust, right? The Vatican and the Pope. This is something that has direct ramification of the life we live in. Having said all that, there is a reason I stopped the talk on this in the last, and I chose to talk about the joint holiday in Mamre in the 5th century. I think the text tell us, so for some reason, people tend to think of the past in a very simplistic way, as if people lived separately and they had nothing to do with each other. Everything in the world we live in tell us that people are complicated, and the world we live in is complicated. And it always goes like that. People were always complicated. People always talk to their neighbors, always were in conversation with their neighbors in the past and in the present. So we can learn from the past about the ways they interacted. For example, sharing a sacred space and not saying it's mine, and don't, and that, but in fact, creating a joint space. That's a nice model to try to replicate. Some models we don't want to, right? Some persecution and some we don't want to follow, or polemics that we find in the text. But when I study the text and I see the complexity on the ground, and I imagine Christians going and celebrating fast with the Jews, that makes me feel hopeful. In the past, Jews and Christians knew how to live with each other and still call themselves Christians and still call themselves Jewish, and that was okay by some and not okay by others. And maybe we can learn something about the world we live in, when sometimes our leaders think that some things are okay and some things are not, and people on the ground think a little bit differently. But once we know to understand it, it's kind of, I always say that what I do in my work is kind of, there used to be when I was little, I think in the 80s, there were those pictures when you would wear glasses or you stare them hard enough, a third layer would pop out and give us another dimension, like a third dimension on this. This is like that. Knowing, looking at the past and understanding its complexity and giving it another dimension of Jewish-Christian relation, and knowing that gives the world we live in that additional dimension. Nothing is new under the sun, and people lived side by side and then polemicized and they argued and they accused each other, but they still, lived in a complex world. And there's something to be said about knowing that and giving this that extra dimension. And so this is why I think my work is especially crucial for what we're going through now.
Thank you. I think that's a beautiful point for us to conclude the evening on. Thank you again, Professor Siegal, for sharing such fascinating texts and narratives and complicating the story. It's not, sometimes it's a good thing to complicate the narrative. Exactly. So thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you for everyone who listened. I hate that I can't see you, but I'm very, very grateful that you came and listened and studied with me tonight and maybe thought together with me about this complicated issue. And I urge you to keep following and coming to the wonderful event of the Haberman Institute and be in touch. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yes, thanks again. And thank you all for joining us. Have a good rest of your day.